Well, good morning, my friends. Over the last few weeks, we've talked a lot about work. We've talked about the importance of work. We've talked about having a good work ethic, being a good worker. But the idea of being devoted to work can be taken too far. It is possible to become addicted to work and become what we might call a workaholic. Now, we're all familiar with that phrase, but being a workaholic can take many different forms. Some people are workaholics in the sense that they never leave work. Getting up and going right to work, staying there until the wee hours of the night, and always working. Especially in this era of working from home, it's really easy to get up, grab your cup of coffee, and go to work, and then not stop until you have to go to sleep. But there's other forms of being a workaholic. There's the workaholic who, they seem to abhor leisure, seeing it as maybe even being morally bad. And generally, when I've met people who fall into this category, it's because they grew up in either a time or place where things were so tight that if they didn't work all the time, then they wouldn't have food. And they carry that over then to times of plenty. And so they feel like if they ever stop working, that bad things will happen. And then there's a third category of workaholic. Hi, I'm David. I'm a workaholic. I fall into this category. People who have so many things that they want to get done that when they get off the clock, they're always working on a side project or a side gig or a second job or something. And they don't give themselves leisure time because there's just so many things that need to get done. Now, on the surface, being a workaholic may seem almost like a profitable trait. You know, you're going to make a lot of money if you're on the clock that long, and you're going to be a diligent worker because you're going to be getting a lot done. You're very hireable because you're devoted to the job. But when you dig below the surface, being a workaholic has a lot of bad sides. For one thing, it ruins relationships. You can't cultivate love within a family. You can't cultivate relationship between your spouse and your children when you're always working. And so being a workaholic ruins family relationships. Being a workaholic also prevents you from digging into God's Word and becoming a spiritually deep Christian. Because, you always are working. You don't have time to dig into the text. But being a workaholic also comes with physical ramifications. When you're always working, you end up stressed. You end up with hypertension and high blood pressure and all the things that come with those. And also, people who are workaholics have a tendency to not let their bodies heal when they get injured. So they get hurt on the job or maybe having fun. And then rather than taking the 2 or 3 weeks the doctor says to relax and let yourself heal, they get right back to work and they injure themselves worse than before. So there's a lot of negative ramifications of being a workaholic. But that then brings us to an interesting conundrum. We know that working hard is needed, and we know that being a sluggard is bad. So how do we balance that? Well, today, as we're wrapping up our sermon series, discussing God's wisdom concerning work, we're talking about balancing work and leisure. Because both work and leisure are important. They're essential. But when we become unbalanced, putting more weight on one than the other, then there are problems. Problems in our family, problems in our spiritual life, problems in general. To have this conversation, we're first going to look at the importance of leisure. We're then going to look at our tendency for extremism. Thirdly, we're going to look at the fact that balance is key. And fourthly, we're going to look at the vanity of being unbalanced. And what we're going to see as we work through this is that whatever we do for work or play, whatever we do in the position of life we are, whether we're people who are stay-at-home parents or whether we're people who are retired or whether we're people in the workforce, that work and leisure balance is essential. Now, one more caveat before we jump in. As we've done in the last few sermons, we're not talking about works-based salvation. We're not talking about being saved by your time at work or your time off of work. But having a proper balance, or more like it, having an improper balance, can impact your relationship with God. So while we're not talking about works-based salvation, some ramifications of having this out of balance can impact your salvation. So let's jump in and let's look at the importance of leisure. And you'll notice we didn't have a section in here for the importance of work because we've already covered that in 2 sermons. If you missed it, go on our website. They're all recorded. You can listen to them there. But there are people who view leisure as bad. I don't know how many people I've talked to when I ask them what they do when they're time off, and they say, I don't take time off. I don't have time off. Well, let's talk about the importance of leisure. First off, leisure is important because God designed us to need time off of work. Let's go to Exodus 20, verses 8 through 11. Now, in Exodus 20, we see the 10 Commandments. And it's important for us to remember, we're not under the old law anymore. We're not bound by the Jewish law. But these things are great lessons for us about the way God made us and what his view of morality is. So while we're not bound by the Sabbath law, it is a good lesson on the way God made us. So, we start in verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. So he tells them, work hard, labor, 6 days of labor. But then he says, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work. You or your son or your daughter or your male or your female servant or your cattle or your sojourner or who stays with you. It says that 7th day you shall do no work. Now, as a side note, the Sabbath was not a day of worship. So it is not analogous to our modern day Sunday. But it was a day off of work. And you notice he doesn't say, don't do any work at your main job. He doesn't say, do no field work, but do other kinds of work. He says, do no work. You shall not do any work. Why? Well, we need time to rest. We need time to recuperate. And he goes further and he says, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Now did God, run out of energy and need to rest on that 7th day? No, he didn't. But he did it for our example. See, God designed us to need some leisure time to recuperate from our labor. And at this point, we could look at a number of different medical studies that have shown the benefits of taking time to recuperate. Taking time where you're not stressed out, taking time where you're not laboring, but you are simply recuperating. There's a huge number of benefits, medically speaking. But this does bring us to a really important question. And that is, what's the difference between taking leisure time and being a sluggard? Way back when I was a little kid, I was listening to a discussion between 2 adults talking about this very thing. And on the one side, the one grown-up was into sports and video games and, taking time off of work. And the other person never took time off of work. They had their main job, they had their side job, and they had their home business, and they never took time off. Or if they did, it was like pulling teeth. And the person who took leisure time said, well, the leisure time is important for my mental and physical health, taking time to unplug. The other person said, but that's wasted time. Time that you could be making money, time that you could be growing your skills, time that you could be bettering yourself. And so that leisure time, they saw it as being wasted. And it really boils down to, what is the difference between taking leisure and being a sluggard? Well, quite frankly, the sluggard rests when they should be working. And I could almost reword this to say that they do leisure activities when there's something important to do, but basically they rest when they should be working. They should be doing something productive, but they're not. They're resting. The wise person, though, uses leisure to recover from work. Now, you notice the difference there. The wise person, they do their work when they're supposed to be doing work. But then they use their leisure time to recuperate from that work so that they're fresh for the next round of work. The sluggard, well, they just never get to the work part. They just rest. So that's the difference, and we see that God, He designed us to need that leisure time. So now let's discuss some practical benefits of leisure time. We're going to be going to Proverbs 15, and in Proverbs 15, 13 through 17, these verses don't necessarily directly address leisure time, but the instructions given in them, we see that leisure time greatly helps us to fulfill what is said in these next few verses. Proverbs 15, 13 through 17. And we read, "A joyful heart makes a cheerful face, but when the heart is sad, the spirit is broken." So this is talking about the inward attitude. What's the attitude of your heart? A joyful heart makes a cheerful face. You know, Jesus talked about how the things that come out of our mouth stem from the heart. But when the heart is sad, a spirit is broken. The thing about this that connects it with our topic today is that scheduling leisure activities gives us time to focus on cultivating joy. You know, if you're always work, if you're always driving and striving, then you're not necessarily taking time to smell the roses, to see what it is that you can take joy in. And this is an attitude of the heart, but that leisure time helps in fulfilling this. It goes on and says, "The mind of the intelligent seeks knowledge, but the mouth of fools feeds on folly." You know, there are some times where you get in a position where you have a job that allows you to seek knowledge on the job. And I feel very blessed that that's what my job is. My job is to seek knowledge and share it with you all. So I get to do this on my work time. But most people don't have a job like that. Whether you're a stay-at-home mom chasing little children around, or whether you're driving a truck or working in a field or working at a desk, generally you can't take time to seek knowledge on the clock. So wise leisure time allows us to seek knowledge for personal growth. Now, someone who doesn't like learning might be saying, "But David, that sounds like work." And it can seem that way. But when you realize that gaining knowledge can itself be rejuvenating and revigorating, then you see the wisdom in taking leisure time to devote yourself to personal growth. It goes on and says, "All the days of the afflicted are bad, but a cheerful heart has a continual feast." I find this so interesting. All the days of the afflicted are bad, we can understand that. But the cheerful heart has a continual feast. Now, I believe that continual feast is not speaking about food, but talking about the attitude of the heart. That when you have a cheerful heart, you find cheer in everything. It's easy to find things to be cheerful in. And godly leisure time allows us to refocus on the reasons for cheer. You ever been in a period of your life where you had to work way more than you want to? And you get kind of down, right? You get maybe kind of depressed, maybe just feeling like there's a lot of weight on your shoulders. But if you get time to step back, you know, focus on your family, focus on the beautiful world we live in, you can remember, you can refocus on the reasons for your cheer and address that attitude of your heart. He goes on, he says, "Better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure with turmoil with it." This kind of hits at the reason why some people are workaholics. Because they want money, right? They want more paycheck. They want more coming into the bank account. Well, better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and turmoil with it. You see, sufficient leisure time helps us to cultivate the proper fear of the Lord. Because again, most people don't have jobs where they can sit and study the Bible on the clock. So if you're not taking time off of work, then you don't have time to sit down and dig into God's Word. Sit down and study. So you need to take sufficient leisure time that you can spend time in prayer, spend time studying God's Word, spend time cultivating that fear of the Lord. And then the final verse in this section says, Better is a dish of vegetables where love is than a fattened ox served with hatred. Better is a dish of vegetables. A dish of vegetables would have been poor people food. This family didn't have enough to slaughter an animal to eat it, so they're just eating vegetables. So better is basically poor people food, a dish of vegetables where love is, than a fattened ox served with hatred. You see, family leisure time gives us occasion to cultivate love in our family. Because love in the family doesn't just happen. It doesn't just go pop and you have it. You have to work at it. You have to cultivate love between you and your spouse, you and your children. But if you don't take sufficient leisure time as a family, then you can't cultivate that. And this also hits at the improper attitude about leisure time that some people have, where some people say, well, my leisure time is disconnecting from both work and family, and they spend all their time at the lake or whatever, and not with the family. But that family leisure time gives us occasion to cultivate love in the family. So we see the benefits of leisure, but that brings us to our tendency for extremism. We as humans are extreme people. And in the past I've used the pendulum analogy, but today we're going to use the scales. We as humans have this tendency to overweight one side, where we put all of our emphasis on work and none on leisure, or we put all of our emphasis on leisure and none on work. Now, let's go to Ecclesiastes 4. This is going to be our main passage for the rest of our sermon, Ecclesiastes 4, starting in verse 4. And we read, I have seen that every labor and every skill which is done is the result of rivalry between a man and his neighbor. This too is vanity and striving after the wind. That's a pretty extreme statement. You know, at first glance, we want to deny that's the truth. We want to say, no, I'm far more altruistic than that. I'm not driven by rivalry. And we may even say, well, humankind in general is more altruistic than that, right? You know, not driven by rivalry. But when we get honest, we see that often a person is motivated by rivalry of some kind. Maybe it's rivalry to give my kids the things I never had, which is kind of rivalry against parents. Which, to be honest, that was my motivation for going to college. Not Bear Valley, not preaching school, but my first bit of college. My goal, my stated goal, was to make more money than my dad. Well, that's a pretty shallow goal. And some maturing has taken place since then. But you think about it. Many people are driven by the drive to have a better house. Well, better than who? A better car. More money. Driven by rivalry. Maybe rivalry with the neighbors, maybe rivalry with self. Solomon says this too is vanity and striving after the wind. Okay, emptiness, meaningless, pointless. So why? Why is it meaningless? Well, because such motivations result in being a workaholic. Someone who sacrifices relationships for work, resulting in greater discontentment. If our motivation is rivalry, there's always someone to be in rivalry with. There's always someone who's got more stuff, is better looking, has better things, is smarter than you, whatever it is. There's always someone better. And so if we're driven by rivalry, well, that leads us to have an unbalanced life. And as we've seen, workaholism is not godly or healthy. It's not something that is beneficial to us. But the imbalance can go both ways. What about someone who puts too much emphasis on leisure? Well, Solomon says in verse 5, the fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. So on the one side is the person who works too much. On the other side is someone who doesn't work at all. And the image here, that he folds his hands, well, if they're folded, they're not doing work, right? It's a position of rest. You can't run a plow or a hoe or a shovel or pull some oxen along if your hands are like this. So being a sluggard is not godly or healthy either. So we see that both extremes are not healthy. They're not godly. They're not productive. So that brings us to the fact that balance is key. Balance is key in all of this, as it is in most every part of life. Verse 4 says, "One handful of rest is better than 2 fistfuls of labor and striving after the wind." And I love the imagery Solomon uses here. One handful of rest is better than 2 fistfuls of labor and striving after the wind. Okay, so if one hand is full of rest, what would the other hand be filled with? Well, it'd be filled with work. So you got 1 fistful of work and 1 fistful of labor. That's a good balance. This is talking about having a healthy balance. But of course, the opposite is true also. 2 fistfuls of labor represents being a workaholic. You're unbalanced. You don't have the room for leisure. And 2 fistfuls of rest would be acting as a sluggard. No time for work. So 1 handful of rest and the other full of work represents a healthy balance of work and leisure. And when we start thinking about our time, our day in and day out schedule, what do? Do we have one hand that we're working, we're doing our job or the work around the house or whatever labor needs to be done that day, but we're also taking time for leisure? Or do we fill both hands with something that's unbalanced? Now, there's a subtext to this whole idea of balance that I think is important for us to hit on. And that is this is also describing contentment. Because the drive to be unbalanced in one direction or the other stems from being discontent. Why do people become workaholics? Well, because they're discontent with something. Discontent with their paycheck, discontent with their home life, discontent with whatever. Why do people become sluggards? Well, because they're discontent with the amount of enjoyment they get out of life. They're discontent with the stress of life or whatever it is. And so they fill themselves with sloth. Let's go to 1 Timothy 6 through 10. And in the section, the verses before talk about how some people preach with wrong motives. They preach to try to get rich. He says in verse 6, "But godliness actually is a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. For we have brought nothing into the world, so we cannot take anything out of it either." So godliness is a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. And I love this statement. We brought nothing into the world, we cannot take anything out of it either. So none of the objects that people covet will last into eternity. Whether it be the money and position and pride that the workaholic is striving after, or the leisure activities that the sluggard is striving after, none of it will last into eternity. So he says, if we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. The basic necessities. See, when we learn to be content with our basic needs, then we will have the freedom to appreciate our leisure time. And I've seen this in action both in my life and the lives of people I know, where when there's not that contentment, you may be forced to take leisure time, but you don't enjoy it. You sit there stewing about work or problems or whatever it is, and you don't actually engage in the leisure. You don't actually enjoy the leisure. And therefore, it does you no good, does it? A day where you're not working, but you're stressing about work, well, that's not a day of leisure. You end up with high blood pressure still. So it all comes down to contentment. He goes on, he says, "But those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare, and many foolish and harmful desires which plunge men into ruin and destruction." So, when riches are our highest goal, leisure feels unnecessary and even a drudgery. I read an interview by a Wall Street person that I think they were bragging about how they had a cot set up in their office. And they were talking about how time off is lost money. Well, when riches are your highest goal, leisure feels unnecessary, even feels like it's a drudgery. He goes on, and says, "For the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil. And some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. My kids have good lungs on them, don't they? For the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil, and some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. So that love of money. Now you notice it doesn't say money is the root of all kinds of evil, just the love of money. Why? Well, again, because people drive themselves to be workaholics. They drive themselves to put away their health, put away their family, put away their relationship with God for the sake of money. So it's essential that we learn how to be balanced in our work and our leisure. And that brings us to our final section, and that is the vanity of being unbalanced. Go back to Ecclesiastes 4. Ecclesiastes 4, verses 7 and 8. In Ecclesiastes 4, 7 through 8, we read, "Then I looked again at vanity under the sun. There was a certain man without a dependent, having neither a son nor a brother. Yet there was no end to all his labor." So Solomon describes here a man that does not have any people he's obligated to care for. He doesn't have a wife, he doesn't have kids, he doesn't have siblings, nobody to take care of. His only obligation is to take care of himself. Now, we may surmise this guy's a bachelor, he may be a widower. We don't know his situation. We just know that he doesn't have any obligations to take care of anybody. Now, he could work just enough for his necessities and use the rest of his time for other pursuits. You know, he could go learn more about God. He could spend time cultivating other skills. He could go travel, whatever it is that he wanted to do. But the text says, "Yet there was no end to all his labor." And the idea put forth there is that it's not just that he worked a full-time job, but that he worked sun up to sundown, that he never stopped laboring except when he absolutely had to sleep. And it goes on and tells why. It says, "Indeed, his eyes were not satisfied with riches." So his motivation for endless work was to acquire riches. He wanted to get rich. But watch what Solomon says. He says, "And he never asked, 'And for whom am I laboring and depriving myself of pleasure?' This too is vanity and a grievous task." What a question. And for whom am I laboring and depriving myself of pleasure? You know, if you had dependents, spouse, children, family to take care of, the answer would be, well, I'm depriving myself of pleasure to care for my family, right? But this guy doesn't have any dependents. He never stopped to consider the results of his actions. Never stopped to think, why am I doing this? And as you study through Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, you find that this is a hallmark of people making bad decisions. When people don't stop to consider the results of their actions, they're generally going to make bad decisions. Whether it be about how much mind-altering substances they imbibe, whether it be about which relationships they get involved in, whether it's about how they use their money. When people don't consider the results of their action, folly ensues. And so thus, he deprived himself of any real joy that this life has to offer. You know, we're only on this earth for a limited amount of time. We've got 70 to 90 to maybe 100 years, depending on how you live. Some people less than that. And Solomon, throughout Ecclesiastes, points out that it's vain, it's empty, it's worthless to spend all of that time laboring and not enjoying life. He says this too is vanity and is a grievous task. See, this man, if he had been considering the results of his actions, he should have balanced his work and leisure so that he had his necessities and enjoyed his life as well. Now, we could make analogies here to people who are single, who don't have families to support yet, that they need to work, need to better themselves, need to strive to do well in life. But they need to take adequate time for leisure, to recuperate, to enjoy their life because they have the freedom to enjoy it. Same with people who are retired. don't have to support their children or grandchildren, if they've got the freedom to take time and do what they enjoy, that's great. We see that balance is so very important. So today, as we've been talking about balancing work and leisure, we've seen the value of leisure. We've seen that we as humans have a tendency toward extremism. We've seen that balance is key and the vanity of being unbalanced. So my friends, wherever we are in this life, whatever our vocation or the ways we spend leisure time, we each should strive to balance our work and our leisure time as God intended. Now, I can't tell you how many hours in each day that really looks like. That's for you to decide based on your family and your needs. But we should strive to balance being good, godly workers, but also taking sufficient leisure time to recover from our labor. Now today, if you have a need, maybe you're not yet a Christian, you need to become one, maybe you need to be baptized into Christ. In a minute, we're going to have our invitation song, and I encourage you, come up to one of the front rows and one of our elders will speak with you. And if you're a Christian who has a need, whatever your need may be, please let it be known as we're led in our invitation song.